3000 NFL mock draft.
3000 NFL mock draft.
With your friends Kenneth and Rob. Talking about the NFL and the draft and the Seahawks.
3000 NFL mock draft.
3000 NFL mock draft.
That's right. It's 3000 NFL mock draft with your friends Kenneth and Rob. It's Tuesday, April 26th, and we are 2 days away from the first round of the 2016 NFL draft. We've been talking about it since August of last year on this podcast, and I can't believe it's almost here. And that's why we're going to do 2 episodes this week. And then, of course, we'll be back later in the week to talk, sometimes during the draft and obviously recapping the draft for the Seattle Seahawks as well as other moves that are going on, because we've talked a lot about a lot of prospects that the Seahawks are not going to draft. I mean, that's one of the things about the NFL draft is you're going to talk about it, and 98 to 99% of the guys you talk about will not be drafted by your team. That's just how numbers work. And then maybe that's not how numbers work. It's all how things fall for which guys you're talking about. Maybe you're only talking about one guy. If you're talking about Jermaine Afadi on this show, maybe, and that's the only guy you target. Well, there's a chance that that's going to be the pick, and then you'll be 100% accurate. But for the most part, we're going to talk about a lot of guys. I mean, Rob, you just posted a list of 100 guys to talk about in the draft this year. And they'll probably draft some guys that aren't on that list of 100. So, it could be anywhere around the world. Is there anyone, if you were to put a 101st name on that list, who would it be?
The guy the most likely to take?
No. If you have a list of 100 names, if you could add 100, if you could add one, who is the guy that didn't make the list?
Wow, there's quite a few. I guess like someone like Deion Jones, maybe at LSU. I didn't put him on the list. I wanted to make it really strictly 100. As I'm thinking of maybe doing like an extended list before the draft actually begins, which has got a few more names in it. But I wanted 100. Nice round numbers, so I had to be quite strict. So people like Deion Jones didn't make it, and Jordan Payton at UCLA. But maybe we should add those guys to a bigger list before Thursday.
Yeah. See, right here on 3000 NFL mock draft is where you'll get the fact that Rob, 100 names is not enough. So we're gonna talk about it. The draft is coming up, and it's interesting because mock drafts and boards, they're all over the place this year. It seems like one of the most unpredictable drafts I've ever seen. I mean, we got guys, I feel like there's going to be guys going in the top 10, at least one or two that will shock people. I feel like there's guys that you think are going to go in the top 10 that'll go in the second round. I could see it being that crazy. We've got people, they don't know which quarterback is the best. We've got people saying Ronnie Stanley is better than Laramie Tunsil, which Tunsil is supposed to be, he was touted as the number 1 pick and a franchise tackle, one of the best to come around. And yet, even on this own podcast, Rob, you don't like Ronnie Stanley that much even. And yet, people talking about him going above Tunsil. We don't know who the best wide receiver are. And we don't even know who couldn't even put an order in the top 10 of wide receivers. And if any of them are going to go in the first round, or maybe there's going to be a run and 5 of them will go in the first round. And it's interesting because people judge so much about where you're drafted, and yet it's still sort of arbitrary. And I think this is going to be a year where you're going to have second rounders, third rounders, fifth rounders, seventh rounders even that are going to be Pro Bowl caliber players. I think this could be a year where it's going to be more about depth than, so much at the top. And yet 2 teams have already traded up to get into the 1 and 2 spot for these quarterbacks. And the Rams aren't going to say which player. They're saying they're not going to say which quarterback they're leaning towards. But pretty much everyone is saying Jared Goff to the Rams and Carson Wentz to the Eagles. It just seems to be that lining up. But nobody is saying why they're necessarily saying that. Rob, you've said why you think that Jared Goff is just a better fit for the LA Rams based on the fact that he's already in California and he sort of has that prototype. What are the odds, do you think, of it being Wentz before Goff?
Well, I think it's pretty unlikely now. There are too many people report, even the people that said it was going to be Wentz, like Sam Farmer at the LA Times, have kind of backtracked now and said it's definitely going to be Goff. It just seems tailor-made, the California guy, really marketable for that team moving to LA. That would seem to suggest it's him. I mean, he's thrown a lot more passes. He's got a bit more experience than Carson Wentz. I think it's a good spot for Wentz to go to Philadelphia and, have an opportunity to sit as long as Sam Bradford, puts his dummy back in and sort of is prepared to sort of get back in there and work for that team as opposed to protesting and wanting a trade. I think it's good for Carson Wentz to be in a situation where he's going to get to sit for a little while because he's got a nice physical profile. He just maybe isn't ready to start week 1. So, I think it's going to work out that way. Goff number 1 and then Carson Wentz number 2.
And then when we're talking about number 3, there's talk of, will the Chargers trade down or there's, and that every time the top 2 picks have been traded, the number 3 pick has also, been traded. It's always happened. So, do you expect the Chargers to trade down? Do you think that there's anything that they necessarily need to stay there to get as far as Jalen Ramsey or Laramie Tunsil, or that there's someone else that wants to get up there and grab one of those guys? What are you expecting with number 3? Do you think the Chargers will trade?
I don't think they'll trade, but it's a really interesting pick because what you've got here, it's going to impact the rest of the top 10 dramatically. So there's been a bit of talk that they're interested in DeForest Buckner, and some scouts, Jason LaConfora quoted a scout yesterday saying that Buckner was his number 1 player on his board from this unnamed scout. And there seems to be a feeling that Buckner could go at number 3. And if that is the case, then Dallas will automatically take Jalen Ramsey at that point. It could mean that Joey Bosa goes to number 5 to Jacksonville. But just imagine if Jalen Ramsey goes at number 3, then you're kind of wondering what the Cowboys are going to do because there seems to be a lot of talk about they'll decide between Bosa and Elliott. But yeah, both players have got a little bit of character issues there. The Cowboys going to go down that road after everything with Greg Hardy. How does that impact Jacksonville, for example, if Ramsey and Bosa are off the board? Do they take Buckner? Do they look at Miles Jack? So there's a huge dynamic there. The one position that seems to have really quietened at number 3 is offensive tackle. They do have 2 tackles in San Diego. Neither of them are really that good. But the feeling seems to be that San Diego is going to go and try and rebuild their defense in this draft. So they'll either go Jalen Ramsey at number 3, and then take a defensive lineman at the top of round 2, or they will take DeForest Buckner because they believe they'll get a good safety at the top of round 2. And I think there's going to be a lot of teams, Kenny, that are looking at safeties in that sort of early second round, late first round range. And that's a good thing for the Seahawks because they pick ahead of Arizona, who are probably going to be looking at that position. Carolina might look at that position, and Denver might look at that position. So, there's a reason to believe that maybe teams will be interested in moving up to 26. Baltimore, for example, might be willing to do that to get a safety that they really like at the end of the first round.
When earlier in the intro there, when I was talking about the unpredictability of the draft and the fact that there could be guys that slide into the top 10, or even slide out of the top 10 into the second round, we've already kind of seen that with Robert Nkemdiche. Yet we still don't know, have we? That it's just. When you look back at drafts, there's very little memory left of if you look at 2011 and it's like, all we say now for the most part is that, Jake Locker was the 8th overall pick and Christian Ponder was 12th and Blaine Gabbert was 10th. And we just sort of take that. I think people do remember sort of maybe more so with Christian Ponder that he was a surprise to go that high. But at the end of the day, you are where you are. So I think if Robert Nkemdiche goes 8th overall or something like that, maybe it's not, that surprising given that he could still be one of the best players in this draft if he ended up keeping his head on straight. But I'm known for making some really good points, Rob. I'm one of the best. I got my pulse on the wrist or something of the NFL, and I'm one of the best. So what did you think about that point about it being perhaps the most unpredictable draft of recent memory? Do you find yourself sort of at a loss sometimes as far as what to try and predict this year?
There's certainly some very interesting storylines that are going to play out in the early part of round 1. So one of the things that's happening at the moment is, where's Miles Jack going to go? Could he go at number 5 to Jacksonville? How serious is his knee injury? How far is he going to fall? So that's something to keep an eye on. There's this whole talk of Leonard Floyd potentially going 5th overall because Jacksonville's defense is built very similarly to Seattle's, and You could imagine Leonard Floyd playing as like a Bruce Irvin type role for Jacksonville. They might feel they need that. So you could see him going as early as number 5, which would be really shocking to most people. But then he could go at number 9 as well. That might be equally shocking if Tampa Bay drafts him. And that's going to be an interesting dynamic. And then you look at the moves that other teams are going to make. It still feels like there's going to be some trade movement there. You know, a Tennessee going to try and get back into the top 10, having traded down from number 1 to try and get after someone like Jack Conklin, for example. Are we going to see the Cleveland Browns continue to trade down? Are we going to see a team make a really bold move for Paxton Lynch? Could there be a bit of a surprise team like New Orleans looking at Paxton Lynch? Because, you know, how many years has Drew Brees got left? And then you kind of wonder if teams are going to move back into the first round to get at the quarterbacks as well, which is something that could impact the Seahawks. So there's a lot of things to be decided there. I think we have a general idea of, for example, who the kind of top 15, 16, 17 players are actually going to be. You know, it's just going to be which order they go in. But there's still a lot of interesting things that could happen.
Yeah, is there like I know a good question from me that's coming right now is if you could compare the 2016 draft class to another draft class within the last 10 years, what class do you think it's most like?
It's kind of tough to just sort of think of it off the top of my head, but I mean, the one thing that I think is good with it, and I would perhaps draw the similarity to 2012. I mean, 2012 was rich for quarterbacks, but then this class doesn't have that. But the thing about the 2012 draft is you kind of felt like, because you were going through the rounds, that you could get good players, you know, in round 2 and round 3, and that there was a lot of options there. And that is very similar this year, because you look at the list of players that could be there in rounds 2 and 3. I mean, Mike Mayock brought his rankings out, and there were guys available according to his rankings, you know, in sort of like the 60s and 70s and 80s range that we've been discussing on the block as possible options at 26 overall. So it just made you realize that, you know, the teams who've got multiple picks in the 2nd and 3rd rounds. So, you know, the Seahawks, 2 third-round picks in a second. Tennessee, their trade with Los Angeles just looks better by the day, because they're going to have so many options in round 2, which is where the sweet spot is in the draft. If I was them, I would not be trading back up into the top 10 and sacrificing those picks. I would just stay where you are, make a good pick, and just build off what you have there. There is just so much depth in round 2 and round 3, and that is why I think the Seahawks ultimately are going to take a deal, probably just for something like a 4th round pick or something modest like that. You know, they're going to take something small, move back into round 2, get a 4th round pick or something, and work themselves into a position where they're comfortable taking the guys they want to take.
Yeah, if you look at the 2012 draft, I mean, the top of it, you know, people talk about the first round a lot with Andrew Luck and Robert Griffin III and Ryan Tannehill, so it's like a high profile with quarterbacks and everything. But in the 2nd round, I mean, especially it's good to talk about the 2012 draft because all these guys just hit free agency, but you're talking about guys like Courtney Upshaw, Derek Wolfe, Janoris Jenkins, Cordy Glenn, Alshon Jeffrey, Bobby Wagner, Michael Kendricks, Kendall Reyes, Zach Brown, Peter Kahns, and Mike Adams, Brock Osweiler, Levante David, Vinny Curry, Kelechi Osemele, and that's just guys that went in the 2nd round. Ruben Randall at the end of the 2nd round. Top of the 3rd round, you're talking about, you know, guys like Dwayne Allen and Tremaine Johnson, guys that have been paid, Olivier Vernon, Russell Wilson, of course. Do you think that it could be that deep in the 2nd and 3rd round? Because that's, I mean, obviously the Seahawks have 2 third-round picks and a 2nd round pick. This is not a year that a team like the Seahawks, knowing how smart they are, they're just not going to trade up, right?
I think it's highly unlikely. I mean, you can never say never because, you know, let's just imagine a scenario where maybe Sheldon Rankins dropped into range and they could move up and get him. You know, you wouldn't completely rule that out. I mean, even then, I think it might be unlikely because the options are so good there. You know, it's almost, in a sense, you can kind of live without the 26th overall pick. You know, it's not that to me does not seem. I know that a lot of people are desperate for the Seahawks to hit on a 1st round pick because they've not done it in such a long time. But that, to me, is not the most important pick in this draft. It's what they're going to do in that sort of round 2, round 3 range, where you're really going to see the teams separate. The smart teams are going to be able to find starters in that range. They're going to be able to find impact players who can start quickly, who can have an impact. And the Seahawks are going to have 3 picks, one at the end of round 2 and then 2 at the end of round 3. Can they find 3 impact players in that range? Because that's going to be the key to the success and failure of this draft for Seattle. At 26, or if they move down, they're going to get somebody else who's going to contribute there. But it's really those sort of 3 picks in the middle that are going to be the difference maker here. Can they get offensive linemen they like in that range? Can they maybe get a running back? Can they get a defensive lineman they like? That's going to be the key for the Seahawks, I think.
Let's say that you're John Schneider and Bill Belichick calls you and he says, I got 2 picks at the end of the second round. I'll trade him to you for the 26th overall pick. Do you take that deal?
That is a great question. Yeah, I think I probably would. And because you would have the flexibility then, if you really wanted to, you could move. You could use one of those picks to move up. So if you wanted to say, okay, we've now got 3 second-round picks at the end of the round, but we want to get into the middle of the second round, you could perhaps sacrifice one of your third-round picks to do that, or your fourth-round pick to do that. So, you could certainly, if there was one guy you really had to have, you could perhaps move up and get them, and still have the 2 late seconds, and maybe even your 2 late thirds as well, depending on what the team was asking for you to move up. So, yeah, I would definitely do that deal, because I think that the second and third rounds, it's where this draft's going to be.
Yeah, I mean, imagine how fun it would just be. Like, it's always nice when you get all the picks or whatever, but the fun of, like, let's say the Seahawks had 3 picks, like within a 5-pick range or whatever, there at the second round. I mean, it's so every year during the draft, it's like, it's fun to watch everything else, but it's also torture waiting for them to get to the Seahawks. And whenever that your team has 2 picks in a row, like they did last year, pretty much with Frank Clark and Tyler Lockett, with there was exciting moments and things happening. Like, it's just that's like the excitement that you live for if you're like guys like me and you who just love the draft and love things happening for your team.
Something, Kenny, I was actually thinking about this, that of all the years that we've had since 2010 with Carroll and Schneider there, in the first draft they had 2 first-round picks because of the Denver Broncos trading theirs away the year before. But since then, we've never really sort of had the luxury of a really loaded draft, where the Seahawks have somehow acquired, an extra first rounder or an extra second round. This is the first year when they've had a third round compensatory pick. Often they've actually traded away their first round pick with Percy Harvin and Jimmy Graham. So there's, we've not really had the real benefit of a huge collection of picks to analyze, like something like 4 to 5 picks in the first 3 rounds or something like that. To get really excited about. This is kind of the closest we've come to that, and it'd be really cool one day, maybe in the next couple of years, if they could do that, whether they trade a player, get a first or a second round pick, or I don't know, make some trade in the draft which enables them to get an extra high pick in a subsequent year. That'd be something that'd be really interesting to cover that, as opposed to covering, hey, they don't have a first round pick again this year, let's look at the end of round 2.
Yeah, it would be really interesting if the Seahawks ever did acquire an extra first round pick again. This organization, I mean, that's something that they inherited too. So they've never really given much credence to first round picks, and we've seen that they've managed to do pretty well for themselves. When we talked about you listing out 100 players to watch out for, you had Bronson Kaufusi listed in the second round as an option for them, which would mean that really you had him listed at the end of the second round as an option for them. You then wrote about Bronson Kaufusi as being a first-round option for them. Why Kaufusi moving up at this point, and sort of just elaborate on what you wrote about why he'd be a fit for the Seahawks?
Well, I had a look. The Seahawks have gone after freaky athletes generally with their first pick. So you could go right back to the start. Russell Okung had unnatural length and size and athleticism. Earl Thomas really, really quick, loads of production, grit. James Carpenter was very, very strong, excellent run blocker at Alabama. paved the way for a Heisman for Mark Ingram. Bruce Irvin, very athletic. Kristen Michael, Percy Harvin, you know all their names by now. And you look at this draft class and you say, okay, if they're going to go down that road again, who are the kind of freaky athletes who they might take with their first pick? And you actually run through the list and you can't really find any. There's not a lot of guys that stand out where you say, well, look at this, look at this trait that this guy has. Wow, he's explosive. He's going to be it might be a little bit of a reach for the Seahawks to take this guy at 26, but that's the kind of pick they make, so we can put him in there and feel good about it. There just aren't those players this year. And I kind of went down the list and looked at Bronson Kaufusi, who I'd talked about as a second-round target, and I looked at him and I said, okay, this is a guy who's nearly 6'7". He's 285 pounds. And this is his athletic profile. And then I compared it next to Jonathan Bullard, who we have talked about a lot, and we've suggested he could be an option for the Seahawks. And when you actually put Kaufusi next to Bullard, the difference was there was hardly any. I mean, Kaufusi was better. Kaufusi's longer, taller, identical weight, almost identical 10-yard split, so the burst similar. And yet Kaufusi's short shuttle time blew Bullard out of the water. It was comparable to J.J. Watt's at a similar size. It was actually comparable, Kenny, to Deron Lee, who is the linebacker at Ohio State, who is 53 pounds lighter. Kaufusi's three-cone is similar to Will Fuller. Will Fuller is 100 pounds lighter than Bronson Kaufusi. So when you actually look at, this is a 6'6", 6'7", 285 pounds defensive lineman, and he's moving as well as Will Fuller, and he's moving as well as Darren Lee. So you can't really ignore that. There's something special there within this guy. Now, people will look at Kaufusi and they'll be immediately turned off because he's 25 this year. People don't want the Seahawks to draft a 25-year-old. That's just one of those things. Fans, they immediately, that is a negative for them. And he's somebody who he's not a big name. He's not one of the big names that people have talked about a lot. He doesn't play for Florida or Alabama or stuff like this. He's kind of, is he going to work out? Is this the Seahawks overthinking it again? That's the kind of impression that Kaufusi gives. And yet, what does he do? He can play defensive end and rush the passer. He had 11 sacks last year, 9th best in the country, up there with, Ogba and all the rest of them. So he can rush the passer at end. He can move inside and play gap control. And look, there are enough people out there saying that this guy can rush from the inside. There's not a great deal of evidence on tape, but Pro Football Focus did a study on him and said that he was really good in the run game, working inside. And there have been some anonymous scouts and some analysts saying that he could develop into a fantastic interior pass rusher. Now, he is not J.J. Watt by a long stretch, but he is that type of defensive lineman, if that makes any sense. And that is ultimately what I think the Seahawks are looking for. So while I don't think they'd take him at 26, if they traded down to, say, 40 or 45, or if they traded to 36 and then down to 40, for example, like they did with Paul Richardson, he could certainly be on their radar in that range. And for me, he could have an impact for the Seahawks, and I think that he is certainly freaky enough. He's one of the freakish athletes that you see in this draft class.
Yeah, it's I just don't know what's going to happen. I mean, when you said recently, this on Monday, just yesterday, writing about you don't really love a lot of guys that are projected to go in the top 40 this year. So being there at 26, it doesn't seem like as ideal, especially like we're saying, if there's so many good players in the 3rd and 4th and 5th rounds, they could have an option to pick up several of these guys that you've mentioned. And if they want offensive linemen, they have an opportunity to draft Joe Dahl and Haig, and maybe, like a LaRaven Clark or whatever. Who do if you've said that you believe with almost 100% certainty that Keanu Neal, your favorite player in the draft, will go in the 1st round and people will act surprised, who do you think will be the guy in the top 15 though that will really surprise people? So who's a guy right now that's not being talked about enough as a top 15 pick, because it happens every year? And who's a guy who's going to be the guy waiting in the green room the longest? Who's going to be the guy that ESPN keeps cutting over to because he hasn't been drafted yet?
Well, the guy I think who's going to last the longest is going to be Robert Nkemdiche. I think that he, they're going to focus on him anyway, but I think he's going to be in for a wait, maybe even towards the end of round 2. It only takes one team. That's the famous saying, but I don't know what would change at this point. I mean, the guy just said he wants a pet panther, for crying out loud. I can't imagine that teams are going to be falling over themselves to welcome Nkemdiche's panther to training camp in a few months' time. The player who might surprise who goes early, it's a good question. I mean, I think that there seems to be a lot of buzz about TJ Green at the moment. Vernon Butler could be someone who sort of squeezes his way into that sort of top 15 range. Maybe it's one of the quarterbacks who surprises.
Who's TJ Green? We've never talked about this guy.
Well, TJ Green, actually, he's not somebody who was really on anybody's radar until the combine. And the reason for that is that if you watch Clemson, they were fielding Green as a free safety, and he would be so far downfield. He's such a deep-lying safety that he basically had no impact on a play. So if you wanted to watch Clemson tape to get a view of TJ Green, good luck even seeing him on the screen because he just wasn't there. So it's very hard to sort of judge what he is as a football player without all 22 tape. But then he goes to the combine and, he was completely under the radar. He goes to the combine and just puts on an absolute masterclass performance. His athleticism, his hips, everything about him stood out as an athlete. And although he played safety in college at Clemson, I think teams are looking at him now as possibly a cornerback, someone that they could train to play as an outside corner. He's 6'2", 209 pounds. He's got the length. And as a worst case scenario, he's a free safety. So he could end up being one of the safer picks in the draft just because he's got that position flexibility. And because he's such a great athlete, there's a chance that he could be this year's answer to sort of Deion Buchanan. I don't think he's necessarily going to play linebacker like Buchanan, but he could be somebody who's a real late riser who just sneaks into the bottom end of round 1.
What about some other scenarios here? If you've got maybe just some interesting things, because what'll really play out if the Seahawks are staying at 26, they're picking behind Washington, which obviously they've got Scott McGlowan, so they've got a similar sort of mindset as the Seahawks. The Houston Texans, the Minnesota Vikings, the Cincinnati Bengals, and the Pittsburgh Steelers. Do you see any of those teams causing a problem, or do you see any of the teams behind the Seahawks trading up and causing a problem that'll sort of, in a similar way, if the reports were true about Dominic Easley with the Patriots drafting him and the Seahawks trading down after Easley fell off the board, though Easley is available to sign. I don't know if he's signed or not, but obviously that pick did not work out for the Patriots. I mean, it kind of did. I mean, they won a Super Bowl, and he was supposedly played pretty well last year, but it has not worked out in the long term for them, obviously. Any teams right before or sort of after the Seahawks that could cause a problem because they're going for the same things?
Certainly Washington, you would imagine, because they might look at those sort of bigger, athletic, mobile defensive linemen that the Seahawks are looking for. So you could see Washington take Jonathan Bullard or Vernon Butler or somebody of that kind. I think it's pretty obvious. There is also a chance that Washington goes safety. I think they could take Carl Joseph or Keanu Neal. I still think that it's going to be a defensive lineman or a safety for Washington. So they might go in a different direction. The Seahawks aren't going to take a safety. So you then get Houston, Minnesota, and Cincinnati. Houston and Minnesota probably going to go wide receiver. So that's not going to impact the Seahawks. Cincinnati have got a need on the defensive line, but they seem to be zoned in on defensive line. So on receiver, they've got a need on defensive line. But I could imagine them going with another receiver as well. So they're probably not too much threat. Pittsburgh, maybe. Pittsburgh love to take outside linebacker, pass rusher types. The Seahawks might be looking at one or two of those. They like big bodies up front as well. They generally draft offensive linemen, defensive linemen, and linebackers. That is what Pittsburgh's trend is. But all of the noise around the Steelers is that they're going to take a defensive back this year. That is their biggest weakness. So I could see them going safety or cornerback, which doesn't impact the Seahawks. And then if you're looking at the teams behind them. I mean, potentially because Green Bay and Kansas City could trade up and get one of the defensive linemen if they want to. I guess Carolina maybe could do that as well. But I genuinely think that the teams from Seattle's pick down, so Seattle, Green Bay, Kansas City, Arizona, Carolina, Denver, they are all going to be looking to trade down. And the benefit the Seahawks have got in this scenario is if all of those teams want to trade down, they're first. You want this guy, well, you can get him at 26. Why do you want to wait till 30? Come and get him at 26. The problem the Seahawks are going to have is they're probably not going to get great market value for trading down. They might just get a 4th round pick, for example, a high 4th round pick. But maybe they use that to trade up in round 2. That's the kind of thing that could unfold here. They might just use that 4th round pick to move up somewhere else, or in the 3rd round, for example. So that's something that they could do. But I think that it's going to benefit the Seahawks. They're all going to want to move down. Seahawks picking at 26, ahead of Green Bay and Kansas City. If you want this guy, come up and get our pick, because then you can guarantee to have them.
We've talked about the Seahawks 1st round pick a lot, and we've talked about Bronson Kaufusi and Jermaine Afraidy and Jason Spriggs, all potential options right there. And then there's several more, of course. What do you think about the Seahawks at 90 and 97 and their picks at the end of day 2? Assuming that they stay there, what position do you think are going to be strongest at 90 and 97? And who do you think you like the most for those spots? Is there going to be a center maybe because if you draft a center at 90, that's pretty strong that you think that guy's going to be starting for you immediately. I feel like from week 1. If you're going maybe like 5th round, maybe that's more of a project. But I'm kind of curious because we haven't talked a lot about maybe the centers that could be going on day 2. 90 and 97, what are your thoughts?
Well, the Seahawks have never drafted a pure center. They drafted Christian Sicoli and moved him from defensive line to center. I think that we're going to see something similar this year because there are guys like Joe Dahl, Connor McGovern, for example, who could theoretically work at center. But the great thing about these two players is that let's say they draft Connor McGovern, for example, you bring him into camp, you trade him at center, you see if he's a natural fit there. If he's not, you move him to guard and you stick by Patrick Lewis. Patrick Lewis is your great hedge for this whole offseason. You've got Patrick Lewis. He's always going to be there. You can test Connor McGovern at center. If it doesn't work out, Patrick Lewis is your guy competing with Sicoli. If Connor McGovern works, he's the center. And you've not really lost anything. You can maybe move Sicoli to guard. You can draft somebody else to play guard. You might have Jermaine Afraidy playing guard. So, I think it's great flexibility to have players who can play multiple positions. Connor McGovern is actually, in his combine interview, he said one of the great benefits for him is that he can play 3 positions. He played tackle in college and guard. So he can play tackle, guard, center. You only dress 7 offensive linemen on a game day. If he can play 3 positions, then that's great. If you've got the flexibility to move him around if you need to, he's going to be invaluable. So I think they're going to draft somebody who I don't think they will draft a pure center. And for the main reason is, we talked about the formula that we were using, Kenny, a few weeks ago. None of the centers got anywhere close to passing the test. None of them have got a 9 feet broad jump, which is something the Seahawks have looked for. So I think they're more likely to look at Connor McGovern and Joe Dahl as guys who could maybe work out as center, see if they fit there. And if not, the worst case scenario is you've got a really good guard or tackle option.
The John Schneider and Pete Carroll had a press conference today and sort of talked about the draft, obviously, and things that they're thinking about and sort of hinting at certain things and trying not to hint too much at other things. What were your main takeaways from what they said today?
They were being very secretive. Pete Carroll was kind of laughing and joking about it, that they didn't want to give anything away. But I didn't really understand that. I know that they don't want to give anything away. That was a given. They weren't going to come out and reveal their draft board. But Carroll seemed to make quite a big point about that today. But there were a couple of things that I thought were interesting. One, Carroll said at one point that he just watched a load of O-line tape and that he hadn't seen one guy knock someone's block off in the running game. He'd not seen a decleat move it or whatever, whichever way he described it. He'd not seen the kind of run blocking he wanted to see. And he blamed the spread offense and the way that things are going with college offensive lines. And I think what I would take from that is it was kind of maybe a subtle message from Carroll to the fan base in don't be surprised if we don't go O-line first. I just kind of read that. Maybe I'm reading too much into that. I think one or two other people have picked up on this as well. Don't be surprised if we don't, because this is the reason why. The offensive linemen out there are not doing what we want them to do. We are a run-first team, and these guys aren't doing it. So we're not going to take one early for the sake of it. That was kind of the message I was kind of getting from that. Or maybe he was just kind of saying, look, be ready when we take our guys. They might not be the guys that you think you want us to get, or they might not be the guys that the media is saying that we're going to get. We're going to take our guys. And this is the reason why. So I kind of like that was, if you're going to read too much into what he said, that is what I would read from that. The other thing I would say is that he made reference to the fact that Chris Clemens is going to play Bruce Irvin's old role, situational pass rusher, comes in on third down or whatever and does that. And he made reference to the fact that defensive ends are basically having to play a linebacker as well these days because of the way that the game is going. And I thought that was interesting as well, because it maybe sort of lends itself to the possibility of, we might take a pass rusher, but this is the role they're going to play. So if Shaq Lawson, for example, dropped into range, would they draft him at 26, use him as kind of like a hybrid linebacker defensive end? Is it a role that Noah Spence could play? Very possibly. Is it a role that Kyler Fackrell can play? Definitely. If they're going to take an outside rusher, maybe that is something that, maybe that's some information that he accidentally dropped out there that, this is how they're viewing that role now. So maybe that's why Frank Clark's also losing weight. Maybe they feel that they need their guys to be at a certain weight to work into this system now. So I thought that was kind of interesting as well. That might be something that we can read into.
It's going to be a smaller episode of 3000 NFL Mock Draft today than normal, but that is also in part, well, if you're going to listen to this too late, unless you're one of the 5 people listening right now, Rob is going to be on Softy at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, talking about the Seahawks and the draft. So it's going to be a shorter episode than usual, but that's also because we'll be back tomorrow with the normal episode as well. And then, of course, I think we'll still be back Thursday and Friday and Saturday. Maybe it's good. Look, this is what the whole podcast is about, is the NFL draft. So we're going to put in a lot of work here. So it is going to be a shorter episode than normal. So I want to go out, but I do want to go out with, there's still more stuff I want to talk about and something to talk about. I still wonder, we've talked so much about Paxton Lynch on this show, definitely more than any other podcast. I can't imagine any other podcast. How many podcasts are out there are so centered around the draft? How many are talking about Paxton Lynch all the time? But, he went from sort of being off of the board to being your first overall pick and the best quarterback. And then teams didn't like him as much and blah, blah, blah. Oh, they like other guys more. I still don't really understand why Carson Wentz is better than Paxton Lynch. I think sometimes things just happen. I don't know how it all works. But anyway, his position is all over the place. So if you look at mock drafts, he's everywhere on every single thing outside of the top 2, basically, or top 3. I mean, he could land anywhere from, the 49ers at 7 to out of the first round, according to some people. I don't think there's enough teams with quarterback needs, but you like him. And I think it could affect the Seahawks as well, because it depends, how far Paxton Lynch falls, of course. But just going over the first round, you've got the 49ers at 7, the Browns at 8, the Bears at 11. They could be the Saints at 12. They've got to get a plan in place for Drew Brees, and Paxton Lynch might be the perfect guy to groom for 2 years or 1 year. You've also got some other teams. Just want to get over the Bills. If they're still in flux with Tyrod Taylor, the Jets, of course, at 20, and then I think you really got to think about those Broncos, of course, at 31, and if Paxton Lynch is available outside of the time, if he's there at 25, it could provide a trade-up opportunity for a team. Like, if he's still there, if the Browns didn't take him, obviously they're there at 32. They might want to get ahead of the Broncos. The Cowboys, do they want to get someone in place for Tony Romo? They're there at 34. The 49ers, if they didn't get a guy, they're there at 37. So where are you at right now with Paxton Lynch? How far could he fall? Is he worth, a team like one of the teams I mentioned trading up for? And like, if he was taken at 7, do you think 4 or 5 quarterbacks could go in the first round this year if Cardale Jones, Christian Hackenberg, or Connor Cook suddenly find themselves going earlier than people had been talking about? Do you think maybe Cardale Jones could be a guy that a team would be taking in that range? So where are you at with Paxton Lynch? And then all my other questions now to you.
Well, I think that there's Paxton Lynch could easily go in the top 10. Whether it's the Jets making a bold move, they have Muhammad Wilkerson they can use as a bargaining chip there. You could see New Orleans maybe even move into the top 10. Let's not completely rule out Cleveland just yet. They may have felt like, we can move to 8 and we actually like Paxton Lynch more than Carson Wentz. So let's just take the guy we like in a position we like. So that's still a possibility there. If he gets past New Orleans at 12, then there seems very little point in teams, making a move up into the teens. You would sort of say the next landing spot is potentially Buffalo at 19, then New York Jets at 20. And if he gets past those two, then he's in kind of free fall at that point. And that's when you would expect teams to start making calls, seeing if they could move up. And as you mentioned there's a lot of teams that would potentially do that. And the Seahawks would be in a great spot, whether it's Dallas moving up or Cleveland again, whether it's Denver who want to get up and get Paxton Lynch, whether it's San Francisco or, there's one, even San Diego maybe might think, hey, let's just stash this guy behind Phillip Rivers for a few years. That seems to be the trend right now, that teams are willing to do that. So there's plenty of options there. I still think personally he's probably going to go. I mean, when I do my mock draft, my final one tomorrow, I think he's probably going to go to the New York Jets at 20 unless I hear anything, because I'm not going to project trades in this one. But I do think there's a chance that someone's going to trade up and take him in the top 12. I think that is probably going to happen. And if that does happen, yeah, there's a chance that another quarterback or two could sneak into the bottom half of the first round. But here's the issue with that. First of all, Connor Cook does not. I mean, he's just. I don't think you can place your trust in that guy to be the leader of your franchise, and to actually trade up and have him having a first round tag over his head, I think is a recipe for disaster. I think he needs to be humbled a little bit by falling in the draft, and that's when you're going to get the best out of him. Christian Hackenberg, has got the physical tools, but is really inaccurate, needs a ton of work. I just have a real hard time imagining him in the first round. And although there's that bit of talk about it, let's see a team actually pull the trigger on a trade to go and get him.
Did you take peeks, or did you watch the full episodes of Gruden QB Camp this year? And did you have any thoughts on the way those guys presented themselves?
I've not seen them. No, I've not seen any of them, unfortunately. But I've watched sort of different things. I watched the Mariucci whiteboard stuff during the combine. I wasn't overly impressed with Jared Goff, but I thought that Carson Wentz was quite a nice personality there that teams will like. And on personality, I think Cardale Jones, this is the big question mark, really, because he seems like, we talked about it a lot. He seems like a little boy, trying to come into a man's world right now. And although he has every physical tool you would ever, want to see, really, fantastic athleticism, really, really elusive in the pocket, fantastic arm strength, can be really accurate, just a really dynamic playmaker. And yet, why wasn't he starting at Ohio State? Why did he lose the job last year? Why did he sort of win the national championship and not follow that up? These are all legitimate question marks. So he could go late first, early second, or he could go in the third or fourth round. His stock's all over the place.
Yeah, I thought, I didn't watch that. Well, I don't know if they were all available in full on YouTube, but I watched a lot of clips, and it really did present, it's the first time, a lot of the times, to just see these guys in their natural habitat, just being themselves, and you can get you at least feel like you can get a lot. Even Mike Nolan today, reiterated that when the 49ers selected Alex Smith over Aaron Rodgers in 2005, it's because they thought Aaron Rodgers was a cocky, arrogant, I'm paraphrasing, but it seems like they just thought he was an asshole. And obviously, part of Aaron Rodgers being cocky has followed him around for the last 11 years, and it's a part of who he is. And, he's going to go into the Hall of Fame, and, maybe sometimes attitude isn't that big of a deal. But I would say, the stuff with Connor Cook, it keeps coming up, and that's probably not going to do him well. And at the same time, I thought Paxton Lynch came off as the best. He was just very calm and playful and just sort of talking like a normal guy. And it seemed like he was smart and he knew what he was doing out there. I didn't think that I can't remember. I probably shouldn't say because I can't remember whether it was Carson Wentz or Jared Goff that I did not like. They did not really come off as good. I think Cardale Jones, his rawness as not, he just seems immature. So I just don't see Cardale Jones working out. I don't see him, it's one of these things. They talked today about Jamarcus Russell still wanting to make a comeback. He did an interview with Sports Illustrated, and he still hasn't given up. It's good for him. He hasn't played in 7 years, and he still thinks there's a chance. And it's sort of the same things to me that it just seems like I don't know that, this was a guy that got benched this year, and he could be going, who knows where his value is. So it didn't come off that great for Cardale Jones to me. And although he could show off, he was throwing passes there with Gruden, and it was impressive. But to be a quarterback, you cannot get away with being athletic. We've seen it with other guys that you just got to have the total package, because only it seems like only maybe 10% of these quarterbacks drafted will ever have any sort of a notable career. So that's it for this week on 3000 NFL Mock Draft. Rob, you have to go pretty soon. Is there anything else you wanted to say before we come back tomorrow?
Yeah, there is actually. There's one quick thing. One of the players we talked about an awful lot during the college season was Vernon Hargreaves. Mm-hmm. And I had we had many debates. I remember having a great debate with Dan Kadar, and we talked a lot about Hargreaves. And it just seems that in the last couple of days, his stock is suddenly going to where we always thought it was going to be on this podcast, which is the late first at best. I listened to the Arrival podcast, inferior podcast between Malcolm and Todd today. And Kuiper was saying that he might fall out of the first round. And this is a guy that has been projecting Hargreaves to be a top 10 pick every week until this week. So, it's interesting. Lewis Riddick had him at the late first round. Todd McShay's suddenly sunk him into the late first round. Teams are clearly voicing the kind of opinions we were during the season, which he's really overrated. And although I thought he had a nice combine, and the talk never materialized that I expected it would, that he was going to drop. It's happening now. And, that'll be one of the shocking storylines, I think, when the draft comes around, that he's going to fall. But it won't be because of anything other than the fact that his tape is overrated. There are better cornerbacks in this draft: Eli Apple, William Jackson, and that's going to be the reason why he falls.
Well, I don't want to take pleasure in someone falling, but it does make me feel good that the stuff that we've talked about on this show for so long, and some of the names and stuff that we were first brought up here, like Paxton Lynch, like Sean Coleman, there's guys that I'm rooting for. I did an interview and a very full profile of Sean Coleman that'll be up on OZ.com this week. I did an interview with Shaq Lawson that went up on Rolling Stone today. Appreciate people who read that. And it's just guys that you want to see go up. And at the same time, if we've been saying that a certain player is overrated, how does the stuff about Ronnie Stanley going above Laramie Tunsil make you feel?
That what makes me feel pleased that teams are thinking that way, because hopefully an NFC team will make that decision, because Ronnie Stanley for me screams Eugene Monroe, a guy who has got all the physical talent in the world, but is not a hard worker and plays soft. And Shaq Lawson embarrassed him in that game against Clemson, Notre Dame Clemson, and I think that Laramie Tunsil's got a much greater upside. Maybe he has got a few character issues that teams have discovered. I'm not sure. Maybe that's why they would lean towards Ronnie Stanley. Personally, if I had an issue with Tunsil and I was going to take a different tackle, I would take Jack Conklin. I wouldn't take Ronnie Stanley. So let's see what happens.
Yeah, we will see. And that's going to come up in 2 days from when we're doing this podcast. Come back tomorrow on the 27th around the same time to listen to the next episode. We'll go more in depth on the draft and talk about the things that have changed between now and then. And it seems like things are changing rapidly. Go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com for constant updates and FieldGoals.com. Subscribe to this show so you can get the episodes for the whole week. 3,000 NFL mock draft. Subscribe and follow on Twitter and all that kind of stuff. So that does it for this episode of 3,000 NFL mock draft. Come back tomorrow for the next draft.